to The Catholic Perspective, a podcast brought to you by rcspirituality.org. Enjoy the episode.
Some straight talk about the Crusades.
If Catholics have any proverbial skeletons in the closet, the Crusades would sure seem to be one of them. Mention of this chapter in church history makes most Catholics squirm, and Catholic bashers know it. They relish making Catholics blush for shame by pointing out that the Crusades were pitiless, bloodthirsty, rapacious, greedy, and unjust wars against the peaceful and meek Muslims living in the Middle East, and that the highest authority of the Church, the papacy itself, was the engine behind them. Are you sure you want to be associated with such an institution? They taunt. Who's to say it won't happen again? There is some truth to these accusations. For example, the Crusades were indeed wars, military campaigns undertaken by European Christians against Middle Eastern Muslims. Likewise, they were called for or approved by popes. And yes, tragically, they did involve atrocities, war crimes, if you will. But does that really mean that they are a black mark against the Catholic Church? Many anti-Catholic critics would like that to be the case. And so, throughout the last couple of centuries, they have tried to make that the case. Indeed, the most common opinion among Catholics and non-Catholics alike, even today, amid overwhelming historical evidence to the contrary, is that the Crusades were an unqualified moral abomination, and it would have been better for the Church and for Western civilization in general if they had never happened. This gross oversimplification and noxious misrepresentation can be cured with 3 small doses of the truth. The truth about the origin of the Crusades, the context of the Crusades, and the conduct of the Crusades. To understand the origin of the Crusades, we need to review a little history. Jesus Christ died, rose from the dead, and ascended into heaven around the year 33 A.D. In the decades immediately following those events, Christianity spread rapidly. It took firmest root in Palestine, in cities like Jerusalem, Antioch, and Caesarea, in Egypt, where monasticism eventually began, and in Asia Minor, later known as Turkey, and Greece, where St. Paul tirelessly planted local church after local church. Both St. Peter and St. Paul also made their way to Rome, the capital of the entire Mediterranean world at the time, and died there as martyrs, giving the community of Christians at Rome a unique status. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries after Christ, the Church kept growing in spite of repeated, systematic campaigns to stamp it out. By the late 300s, in fact, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and the most venerable Christian communities at Jerusalem in Palestine, Antioch in Asia Minor, Alexandria in Egypt, and Rome in Italy had become the leading religious as well as civil centers of Christendom. Along with the latecomer Constantinople, a city also located in Asia Minor on the far west border, which Constantine had made into the new residence of the emperor. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the western half of the empire fell under the devastating attacks of non-Christian barbarian hordes. Only the efforts of the popes and the Church's many missionaries and saints were able to preserve civilization in what would later become Europe by absorbing and evangelizing these invaders. Meanwhile, the eastern half of the empire, Egypt, Palestine, and Asia Minor, continued to flourish economically, culturally, and religiously. Throughout these centuries, the Holy Land, that is, the land where Jesus himself had lived and worked, was a popular destination for Christian pilgrims coming from the wilds of Europe. The 7th century, however, ushered in a radical change. In that century, Muhammad, the Arab founder of Islam, began his religious and military conquests that spread and intensified after his death. In fact, by the year 750, Islamic armies had taken over Palestine, Asia Minor, Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. They were making incursions into France in the west and setting their sights on Constantinople in the east. What happened to the Christians in those ancient Christian territories that were now under Islamic rule? it depended to a large extent on what the local Islamic leader decided to do with them. Some tolerated Christians, others massacred them, others forced them to convert. During the 8th and 9th centuries, therefore, many of the most ancient and revered Christian communities declined. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Pope continued to lead the Church. He also served as a crucial catalyst for social and political unity in a weak, primitive Europe that struggled, under Charlemagne and his successors, to maintain its integrity while surrounded by the highly developed, economically, numerically, and militarily superior Islamic civilization. And at the same time, the Eastern Emperor, still residing in Constantinople, continued to rule Byzantium, which consisted of Greece, the southern Slavic peoples, and the western edge of Turkey. During that period, the Muslim rulers of the Holy Land respected the Christian communities that still existed around the pilgrimage sites, like that of Christ's tomb, known as the Holy Sepulchre. They gave these communities a certain amount of autonomy and allowed the steady stream of European pilgrims to continue flowing unmolested. But in the 11th century, this precarious balance of Mediterranean power came undone. The different Islamic leaders began fighting among themselves with two important consequences. First, they destroyed the Holy Sepulchre, and second, the Seljuk Turks, Muslim immigrants from Mongolia, conquered and occupied Asia Minor and Palestine, harassing the Christian communities, violating pilgrims, and threatening Byzantium. It was in that historical situation that Pope Urban II, at the famous Council of Clermont in 1095, called on the leaders of Europe to undertake what would later be known as the First Crusade. He explained that the holy Christian sites were being desecrated, Christians, native and pilgrims alike, were being persecuted, and the last protection against Muslim aggression in the East, Christian Byzantium, was on the verge of collapse. To protect Christendom and to liberate the Holy Land, he exhorted European Catholics to take arms against the imminent threat posed by the Seljuk Turks. That was the origin of the Crusades. Is it shameful? Is it abominable? Is it even unreasonable? Outnumbered, outfinanced, outflanked, the Europeans formed 4 small armies and set out to defend their Christian brothers in the East and re-establish safe pilgrimage routes. That was what Pope Urban II called for in the First Crusade, and what future popes would call for again. In all, 8 such crusades took place, along with many other smaller ventures, throughout the next 200 years. None of them had lasting success, and most of them were downright failures, as today's demographics clearly demonstrate. It is worth pointing out that fears of a Muslim invasion of Europe were not unfounded. Later, in 1453, Muhammad II captured Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, and then in 1480 he successfully invaded Italy as well, occupying the city of Otranto. In 1571, the great Ottomans extended Muslim rule to the island of Cyprus, and in 1683 the Turkish leader Kara Mustafa advanced on Vienna itself with 30,000 Muslim troops. In all these cases, Europeans were called upon to defend the borders of Christendom and the European way of life, just as they had done during the Crusades. The origins of the Crusades, then, show clearly that they were justifiable endeavors, defensive military actions undertaken to resist an unjust aggressor. If the modern mindset is reluctant to call such endeavors honorable, it at least has to admit that they were certainly not dishonorable. Some critics take a rather different approach to bashing the Crusades. They take issue with the religious aspect, implying that the Crusaders were intolerant religious fanatics, medieval fundamentalists bent on the forcible and unjust conversion of Muslims to Christianity. This, too, is a gratuitous caricature, which our second dose of truth, that having to do with the cultural context of the Crusades, will set right. The Crusades preceded the modern emergence of secular nation-states, as well as the modern idea of an absolute separation between religion and public life. Throughout the vast majority of human history, including Europe, Asia, and the Middle East during the Middle Ages, culture and religion have been intertwined, like two strands of hemp woven together to make a rope. Religious values were considered the highest values of all, worth defending, worth fighting for, worth dying for. Political leaders were, by default, also religious leaders, not only in the Islamic Middle East, not only in Europe, but everywhere. The Crusaders were not fighting to defend their countries. They were fighting to defend a way of life called Christendom and based on the Christian ideal of love for God and love for neighbor, an ideal that was even then shaping one of history's most remarkable civilizations out of the barbaric chaos of the Dark Ages, a civilization that would eventually give birth to the concept of human rights and human dignity, in addition to its many other contributions. This is why no one thought it odd that the popes were issuing calls to arms, neither the Christians nor the Muslims. In fact, when the Byzantine emperor appealed to Western Europe for military reinforcements against the Turkish onslaught, he sent his appeal to the Pope directly, as the most natural leader of the cause of Christendom. The Crusades even inspired contemporary Muslim leaders with deep respect for their papal counterparts. And the Christians at the time would have been scandalized if church leaders had not encouraged the crusading effort, turning a deaf ear to the cries of their Christian brothers and pilgrims in Byzantium and the Holy Land, and letting the Holy Sepulchre itself suffer desecration and sacrilege. To accuse the Crusades of injustice or fanaticism, simply because religious motivations were involved, not only ignores the facts of history. The leaders of the Crusades did not force conquered Muslims to convert to Christianity, but more importantly, it unfairly and inaccurately passes judgment on the Crusades outside of their legitimate cultural context. Finally, the least substantial criticisms of the Crusades have to do with how they were conducted. Tragically, some soldiers, laymen, merchants, nobles, and even clerics used the Crusades as an excuse for crime. Some anti-Semitic groups declared unofficial crusades against European Jews. Some crusading armies violently sacked and looted conquered cities, massacring their inhabitants. This was common military practice at the time, used to punish cities that didn't surrender peacefully. And in some cases, as in the Fourth Crusade, Catholic and Orthodox Christians intrigued and warred between themselves instead of against their common enemy. The popes at the time condemned all these crimes, and Pope John Paul II publicly apologized for the Fourth Crusade in preparation for the Great Jubilee of the year 2000. The Church does not excuse or ignore these crimes. They are as despicable as the crimes of certain Allied soldiers during World War II. But in neither case is it accurate or fair to identify the overall effort with these criminal actions. As our Lord made clear in his parable of the weeds and the wheat in Matthew chapter 13, his good seed will grow up right next to the devil's bad seed up until the very end of history. So the next time you hear someone bashing the Church because of the Crusades, help cure their misconceptions by giving them a triple dose of truth about the origins, the context, and the conduct of those remarkable and fascinating phenomena. Who knows? Perhaps they'll end up like the famous author of the multi-volume History of the Medieval Popes, who was so impressed by the Catholic Church's miraculous ability to maintain its growth and integrity in spite of the human failings of some of its members, that he decided to become Catholic himself. And that's some straight talk about the Crusades.
You have been listening to The Catholic Perspective, a resource from rcspirituality.org. Please visit our website and check out more great resources to help you pray, learn, grow, and go. Please join our team of digital missionaries by subscribing at rcspirituality.org.